Ed, if you don't mind, I would love to just briefly hear kind of, the story of SunRun, the initial idea for folks who may not be as familiar. Give us some context before we go forward in this conversation.
Yeah, sure. So rolling back to like December 2006, I had a high school friend who had been in Afghanistan, and when he came back, he was like, "Hey, have you looked at like solar power recently? It's getting cheaper. California passed this incentive program." And like honestly, at that point, I would have thought, solar power like made sense on a satellite, but like not terrestrial ground power generation. But you looked at it and you were like, "Oh, okay." Clearly, it was going to get a lot cheaper. The technology was, had been made in the 70s, so you knew it was going to work. And there looked like there was a really interesting opportunity actually in deploying it. There had been all this upstream investment in technology, but no one had even thought through like how do you deploy it. And we thought that there was a really good opportunity to do that. It was a business model that required finance, marketing, operations. It was something we felt like we could do. Lynn Jurich, also a classmate of mine, unfortunately can't be here today. She's recovering from neck surgery. It went well, but we felt like this could be like a really fun thing to do. Literally, I think when we went to decide to really go forward with it, Lynn was like, "Well, we'd both worked in private equity before," and she was like, "We could lever up mattress companies and sell them back and forth to our friends, or we could do this." And so the theory was that. And those who had thought about how to deploy solar were doing it centrally. The history of energy generation in the country was big central power plants, transmission, distribution, and then consumption. And the centralized model was, highly competitive. There are lots of companies that make wholesale power. You're responding to RFPs run by utilities who are excellent purchasing managers. Very long, slow cycle times, hard business. But sitting between that business and like everybody who uses power are these monopoly utilities, generally disliked by their customers, who, because of their monopoly position, end up selling power. At the time it was 4 or 5 times the wholesale cost at retail, but now it's probably 8 to 10 times in much of the country. And we were like, wow, that seems like a much easier place to compete, both because the power price is higher, so you were less subsidy dependent. You felt like there was better entry barrier opportunity because there's a big minimum efficient scale in that kind of business. And we felt like it was, classically ripe for disruption because of the low customer satisfaction, right? And so that was the theory. We learned a lot on the way, which we could chat about, but that was sort of like how we got excited about it to start the business.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I think it's a great intro and level set for us as we go forward today. We spoke a little bit early on the phone this week, and you said, I think people in my class kind of get the picture about what this is at this point. Like, maybe we can talk about some of the later stage stuff that the company went through. I'd be curious to just get a show of hands from folks here in the room. How many people graduated from the GSB before 2000? Anybody? Any old timers here? All right. Before 2005? Great. 2005 to 2010? 2010 to 2015, and after 2015 are still a student. Awesome. So I think that tells us a little bit of the story right there of who's in the room, and that'll help us going forward. So just starting with kind of the idea phase and traction, I want to talk a little bit about when you knew you had something big as opposed to just this is an idea that's kind of fun that might work. Did you have like a serious aha moment of, wow, this is really going to work, this is really going to scale, or was it more of a growing understanding over time?
It was, you could be really confident in it in theory because you knew the numbers were going to work, right? So what was fascinating was, given the incentives that were in place then, if you were like a California homeowner and you installed solar, you'd probably get like a 15% unlevered return. Like that's an awesome rate of return, but only like 35,000 people had done it. And so you had to ask the question, well, why? And what we came across was 2 answers. One was, well, first, lots of people just don't want to spend $25,000 for like something they're already getting. And 2, no one really understands energy or solar energy. And if you were to put solar on your roof, it's like, am I getting the right equipment? Who's installing it? How much power is it really going to make? How long is it going to last? There are differences in the product, but you can't figure it out. And then when you looked at who was doing it, it was like dual wage earners in their 50s with kids who are really busy. And it was just like never the thing anyone had to do today. So the theory was if you could pay for the installation, sell the power at an obvious rate that was lower than the utility rate, and with the pitch, look, you only pay us for the energy we deliver. It's cheaper. It's better for the environment. Like, why wouldn't you want that for your family? Like, it really, the theory was it was going to unlock the market, right? And very quickly selling it, you could see that was happening. We became the fastest solar company, largest residential solar company very quickly. There were some bumps along the way as the incentives changed in 2008, but where we had to like restart the company. But you could see that there was product market fit and that everyone in the ecosystem was making money. So it just felt like it ought to work.
Yeah. And in terms of when you start up the company, there are certain things that are going to have to change process-wise as things scale, as you get that traction. Can you think back to any moments in your journey with the company as a founder where you saw sort of like the nature of the company that you're running start to change, to go from that scrappy operation, maybe the office gets a little bigger, you hire a bunch more people, and just talk a little bit about how that changes your thinking as a co-founder and as an executive, and then also how do you still maintain the culture that you've really tried to build from the first 10 people in the room?
Yeah, well, a lot in there. And culture is like every time you think you've got it, and then you hire 3,000 more people, you're at risk of it totally being fucked up and having to start over again, right? So I think we had a very easy job. I think in the early days in the company, it started out really as a finance company mostly. There was a marketing component and some but it was really mostly finance. And finance scales really nicely. So from 2007 through 2014, the company still only had a few hundred people, which is relatively easy. Along the way, we did have some restarts and some bumps, and our business model obviously relied on two things. One, obviously, financing a consumer product, and then the other one, because solar is incentivized through the tax system, like a bank that would buy tax credits from us. So, and we started the company, I remind you, in 2007. So, in 2008 and 2009, this is when you really thought, well, maybe we weren't going to make it because, we had this robust process for our first financing, and I remember that summer there was a movie. The plot was like it was a virus, and when you caught it, it made you kill yourself. And that was sort of like the experience talking to all these banks. Every day someone else would call and be like, "Well, the CFO called us up, and we're not going to be profitable for taxes for another 10 years. Talk to you in a decade." And so we finally were able to like find one bank, U.S. bank, that was in good shape and got the company going, but that was close. After we got into installation and sales, and now you're growing the company, hundreds of people per month, and trying to maintain a culture, where you've got 40 branches and salespeople operating by themselves, and like that's where it gets like really tricky and interesting, and where it's there have been arcs of it over time. I think we've gotten better at it now. We've actually, if I had known we'd have the jumbotron above us, like one of the really interesting cultural things is like so many of our people work alone. Like salespeople who work alone, people who work at Costco or Home Depot selling solar work alone. Like how do you make them feel connected, social to the company? And so we have this awesome video production effort called The League. Some of it you can even Google. It's not all like behind a wall. Which basically sets up these like competitions. It's like a full produced like ESPN Sports Center sort of thing, where there are competitions and like the salespeople are teamed up into groups, and like it really, and then all the executives in the company like participate in the videos, and it's very high energy, and we're now about to like launch that with the installation crews as well. So like that, like these are tricks like how to use this sort of technology to keep the culture, and then we also went through a major acquisition. 2 years ago, where I would say the legacy SunRun culture was very deliberative and maybe a little slower moving than we would have liked. And the company we acquired, Vivint Solar, had a very action-oriented, not quite as deliberative culture. And we're trying to push it together into like an informed, fast-moving culture, which I think is succeeding. But like every time something like that happens, an acquisition, you're hiring thousands of people. Like if you don't pay attention to that in a second, it can change, and then you have to grab it back. Tricky.
Yeah. And so I know, kind of building on the theme of scaling up, facing new challenges, having the company evolve in certain ways as you grow. For a lot of potential entrepreneurs here at the GSB, it can be intimidating when you feel like, I've got a great idea, I got to 20 people, it's good, it's all engineering, whatever, we build up a sales team. Now we're starting to grow and grow and grow, and I don't know how to manage that growth. I have to be a fundamentally different kind of manager to be the manager of, I think it's like a village versus a state versus a country in terms of kind of scale terms. How do you think about the management approach evolving and maybe who you need to bring on board as more professional type of management, different kind of management philosophy as the company grows in that way?
Well, this is why I think that the most important thing, I think, for a company's success is the self-awareness of its leaders. Like, I remember when I was at Blackstone before SunRun, you'd see all these companies come through, and there would be awesome management teams with you thought like smart people with horrible businesses, vice versa. And I remember at one point kind of asking myself the question, like, do the managers even matter? And then I think it was like, that's where I think started to focus in on this like self-awareness concept, where if you like, you're really kind of only good at one thing, but you're really good at it, but that's what you stay focused on. And if you do something else, you find other people, and like those people succeed. And the really, really, really smart people who still get over their skis, like get over their skis. So I think step one is just being as self-aware as you can be. And then when you're self-aware, you'll hopefully identify your weaknesses, and then you have two paths. You can work on them and improve them, or you can hire people around you, and you can change roles. In the case of SunRun, when we came out of the gate, I was the CEO of the company through about 2014, I think. When we were really a finance company, and like that is quite suited to like my skill set. And then we bought an installation company, we added sales, and I was just like, this is, And then Lynn took we actually transitioned it. We were co-CEOs, and then she took the CEO role. And then, she ran with it beginning in then 2015 or something. I might be butchering the exact year. And I took this executive chairman role where I was doing capital raising and policy and legal and, M&A type stuff. And and that really played to my strengths and was awesome. And I was managing, 200 people, not 5,000 people. And then last year we actually hired another CEO, and Lynn joined me in the executive chair role. And now we have a real awesome people leader, right? And the company is now 10 going on 12,000 people. And you just have to you have to spot those moments and work and change and adapt with them and grow if you can. And then at some point it's just maybe someone could do this better, and then you just have to figure that out.
Yeah. And I think it's such a trope that we hear about MBA seeking technical co-founder, right? And the idea that it's different types of skills that need to fit together to start a successful company. But I think there's also a real personality fit component there. And so I'd love to hear you just talk a little bit about your relationship with Lynn, how you got started together as co-founders, and how that's evolved over time.
Yeah, great question. So we had 3 founders actually, right? This friend of mine, Nat, who was a high school friend of mine, and then Lynn. And I would say we definitely all underestimated the degrees on which you really need to fit with your co-founder. And I think, in the case of Lynn, we lucked out. I think, we had some idea, but it turned out, we could run the business effectively, if we wanted to, meeting with each other 90 minutes a week and then just dividing and conquering. And there wasn't a major strategic decision that we disagreed on. We had the same viewpoints on people, but our skill sets were different. And then we just went our ways and ran the business. And that's awesome. One of the things a lot of people call me when they're starting businesses, and that experience has also led me to give the advice, personally, I don't care what the dilution is. Having a co-founder is just such an emotionally helpful way to be. Hopefully on the one hand, they're adding value and maybe the whole pie is worth more, but just having someone else to talk to about the, trickier issues, and just to avoid that sense of aloneness, I think that can come particularly in more trying times. I just think that is just enormously beneficial from a emotional health perspective, even just to know if I can even take a week vacation maybe and not have to worry about it. That's awesome. But I would say really, a co-founder is is like, I mean, people talk about like their work spouses, like that's really what it is. Like your value set matters, like how you deal with people matters, like the culture that you want to build matters, your decision making, you know, and then I think the self-awareness, right? And I think if all those things fit together, it's awesome. You know, so our third founder, you know, exited the business, you know, in like 2009 because that wasn't a good fit. And for Lynn and I, it was a good fit. But I think if it's a good fit, it's just a real force multiplier.
And I'm hearing, with respect to how that relationship helps you get through the rough times, maybe an echo of what you mentioned earlier about the struggles in 2008 to kind of, you know, get financing and see the company through a really difficult time. Can you talk about what it felt like to be in the room, you know, with Lynn, with the rest of the team at that point, just working through that and not knowing if you're really going to pull through and be viable in the long run?
Yeah, so we actually had like two crazy challenges at once. So one was the financing the business, which I was running point on, and the other one was obviously scaling the operations of the business, which Lynn was running point on, and which was going great up until this moment in November of 2008. You know, when we started the business, there was this weird arbitrage in the tax law where a homeowner buying a solar system could only take a $2,000 credit, but a business buying a solar system could take a 30% credit. And we were a business buying a solar system, so we got the 30% credit, but all of our customers were individuals. So there's this like massive arbitrage. Like the company was just printing money, you know, if it had had that tax financing in place. And in 2008, one very good thing happened was the tax credit was extended for 8 years. That was awesome. The other thing is the arbitrage was removed. And we were at that point taking like $8,000 prepayments from customers, you know, because we were thinly capitalized and the arbitrage was so large. And then that all went away. And our sales went from like number 2 in the industry to like 0, right? And then we had to like rebuild all the marketing messaging, the product, and do that all while I'm like trying to do this debt financing on the side, right? And we just never would have succeeded as that, I think, as a single person. And that, you know, one of, you know, countless examples, I think, like that, you know, in the company's history where it's great to just be able to focus on like a really critical thing and just trust, you know, that the other person is going to deliver, you know, what they need to deliver.
Sure. And you mentioned being thinly capitalized. This is something we discussed a little bit the other day, but I would love to just hear your take on the Cleantech 1.0 bubble, some lessons learned from that. How, you know, was it frustrating for you to go out to VCs and not really have them understand what you're trying to accomplish with this company, and how has that changed over time? How have you seen that evolve?
Yeah, so there were a number of interesting lessons that we learned. The first one was like VCs don't understand finance.
You heard it here
You
first.
know, like, you know, when we were pitching our Series A to Kleiner Perkins, I won't name the partner, but we were describing like, you know, here's how the numbers work, and here's the financing, here's how you, and the guy literally looked at me and went, "We do not understand this, but we need to." And, you know, they had invested, I don't know how many hundreds of millions at that point in stuff that people like us were going to have to sell, you know, and they didn't understand how it was going to get sold. So like, you know, and like, what's the difference between a cost of capital and cost of debt, and like really basic stuff, you know, I wouldn't assume a lot of people know. Second is like the cognitive dissonance of our business was much harder to finance than we expected, because there had been, as I mentioned, a lot of VC investment in solar technology. And a lot of that technology was premised on the fact that polysilicon was expensive and someone needs to make a solar panel that works with something other than polysilicon. But that whole business model was predicated on basically a high sale price for solar panels. So here we come along saying solar, you know, look at all the upstream investment in polysilicon. Like that stuff's going to go from $400 a kilogram to 20. PV panels are going to be cheap and available, and like we're going to crush it. And to believe that, you have to believe all the money you just invested is worth zero.
Commodity companies.
Right, because, well, even levered commodity, right? Because they're basically saying, okay, we're taking a more expensive technology, and we're going to do something new, right, in an attempt to undercut the photovoltaic technology that uses polysilicon. But that's expensive. This was like, you know, there's a very famous you know, dragged through the mud, Solyndra, right, company that, you know, but this was their business model, right? And when, you know, you showed them the data around polysilicon investment, it's just, they kind of freeze, right? And then they're like, wow, how do I manage that? And so actually most of our VC investors were people who hadn't made clean tech investments before, like Sequoia or Excel as examples, right? And that was interesting because you think, okay, well, it's a clean tech company, let's go to the clean tech investors. But it kind of turned out the clean tech investors had bet on the other side, so you had to basically go sell the other types of investors, which was just something we had to learn along the way.
Right. I think that speaks a little bit to the business model of, like you said, just sort of the bare bones technical innovation side of it versus finding a business model that works for these new technologies that are becoming much cheaper. As you look at this kind of clean tech 2.0, climate tech, this new wave, hopefully it's a wave, not a bubble. There are a lot of companies popping up that may be making similar mistakes. There are a lot of companies popping up that are more maybe in the SunRun mold of building a really well thought out business model around these kinds of technologies, battery storage, green hydrogen, all this other stuff as it becomes cheaper. Is there anything that you're specifically excited about when you look at the landscape of what clean tech and climate tech looks like today?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were talking about this yesterday. Like, there is a lot of opportunity in the business model side, taking technology that's basically game ready or almost game ready and productizing it, maybe in a new use case with a little bit of technical innovation in a way that you can scale quickly. Like, the sad reality of where we are, with the climate today is like nothing that is in the basic sciences today is going to help us. Like, fusion, if it works, will be awesome. It will be retiring solar and wind plants that have batteries. And maybe it will be a cheaper technology in 50 years. But if we're going to get to an acceptable place, with global warming, it just has to be with the stuff we already have. Solar commercialized in the 70s, wind 70s, 80s. Even fission nuclear, we all know, invented in the 40s. Still only getting slowly deployed in the 90s. It's just to get the stuff to work, to test it, to warranty it, to get it so that you can finance it at like 3%. This is like without capital costs like that, energy technology doesn't work. It just takes decades, But there is a lot of opportunity right now in this area of like fixing and productizing stuff. Like there's a lot, for instance, in our sector right now, trying to end run like kind of ridiculous utility policies. Like, I'll give you an example. The main panel in your house is rated. It'll be like a 200 amp panel, which means it can accept 200 amps. But like 99% of the time, your home is using like 6 amps. And it's sized such that you could plug a hairdryer into every plug in your house, turn on your air conditioner, charge your electric vehicle, the whole thing, and then it still works. And then the utility itself builds to that standard behind it. So the whole thing is just vastly overbuilt. Next, you get the challenge that if you want to add something to your home, like an electric vehicle or solar or storage, you need to find space in this panel. And probably the panel is full. And if you ask the utility for a bigger panel, that takes like 2 months. And then you say, well, okay, so when their like hot water heater breaks, the guy's like, well, would you like a heat pump hot water heater? It's cheaper, it's better for the environment. Like, only downside is you have to take cold showers for 2 months. But it turns out if you put some very basic technology in the main panel, it can meter it. It can say, okay, we're going to accept 250 amps of potential demand, even though it's a 200 amp panel, and in the wild case that we get more than 200 amps, which you're never going to get, it just throttles something. It turns your air conditioner off for a split second, which will actually never need to happen, just based on the, So like there are like these simple things like that there's a lot of opportunity for. But I think the very, very basic stuff, could be a cheaper way for us to run the planet, long time in the future, but isn't going to solve our near-term problem.
Absolutely. And in connection with that, one thing that you mentioned that a lot of people have noted as well about distributed energy resources, behind the meter solar generation, storage, right, heat pumps, pool pumps, all of these different kind of dispatchable demand side loads that we're seeing. There's a ton of regulatory issues around it. There's a ton of sort of thorny fights with utilities about who's allowed to do what on which side of the meter. Without getting too energy wonky about this, because I know we love this stuff. I don't know how much all of you love this stuff, although I hope at least some of you do. Can you just talk about what the regulatory relationship has been like and how that's changed over time as SunRun has gone from one of the little guys to really kind of a juggernaut of behind the meter solar?
Yeah. Well, so obviously we have this interesting situation with utilities, which is that they don't employ salespeople, they're not really liked, they don't even try to compete with us commercially, right? So on the one hand, we've got this business where like the incumbent like doesn't even offer a competing product, and you're like, well, that's kind of cool. But then on the other side, how they compete with you is to try to design policies, to make your business model impossible or unprofitable or to screw your customers or something, right? And so where you end up really competing with them is on the regulatory side rather than on the commercial side. And when we got going, none of the utilities thought like solar would be cost effective. And so they were actually very supportive of it. They were like, we'll get a pat on the back from the regulator. It looks nice. It's a nice TV commercial, and things were actually very easygoing. And then I think beginning around 2012 to 2014, it became clear like this is just like distributed energy is just structurally cheaper than centralized, like when you fully burden it with transmission cost and the whole thing. And then they went into a panic, right? And then they try to change all these rules around, to make it uneconomic to make your own power or whatever. And in these like crazy inconsistent ways, right? So as an example, the California utilities, there was even a proposal in California to basically say, for the power that you generate yourself in your home, we're going to tax you 14 cents a kilowatt on it. Even if you make it and use it yourself, you don't export it, you just make it, use it yourself. We're going to charge you 14 cents a kilowatt for it. That's more than the full cost of retail power in 42 states, right? It's just clearly an anti-competitive proposal, right? And the utilities are basically saying, well, someone has to pay for the grid, and if you make less energy, then other people have to pay for the grid, and so you should pay anyway. Getting past the falseness there, which is the grid isn't actually a fixed cost. You can look at just the inconsistency in it, because the utilities all get paid billions of dollars to subsidize energy efficiency, right? So if you want, lots of Californians, if you want to like insulate your home, PG&E will give you a subsidy to do that. They earn a profit on the subsidy, and in effect, what's happening is they're just going to sell you less energy, right? And so they have a profit motive to do that, and they're super happy because they have a profit motive, right? But when you take it, upon yourself to reduce your electric demand, they're like, whoa, no, we need to tax that. So you just have to, and this gets into like, how do you message it? How do you communicate it? Mostly voters totally get how ridiculous it is. And the polling is all 80 to 90% kind of in favor of what we do. But like, that's the challenge, right? And it's a challenge that we have to really litigate in the media and with voters for the most part, because the solar industry is never going to out-lobby and out-contribute the electric utilities. The CEO of the utility trade group makes $5 million a year. Our whole policy budget is 10. So you can't win on that playing field, right? You have to choose a different playing field, which is really to litigate it publicly, and that's where we meet with almost all of our success.
And was that level of kind of eventual resistance and pushback from the utilities something that you had really bargained for, or was it more of an aha moment where the company got big enough, got influential enough, you thought, oh, well, now somebody's coming after us. We really know we've made it, in a sense?
It was a little surprising because the utilities in many of the places we operate, and this is just something we slightly misunderstood. We were like, well, they don't really care about our business model because they just kind of, they earn a regulated rate of return that's, hey, they have this much invested capital, and, they get a 10% return on equity, and so do they really care what we're doing? Well, it turns out when you're really successful at our business, their investment opportunities dwindle. Like they can't build transmission anymore. Their needs to upgrade the grid are diminished. And so now you actually are, as you begin to succeed and at scale, you really are diminishing their earnings potential. And like that's what causes them to fight. And the extent to which they fight and some of the tactics they've used, yes, have been surprising. We learned that lesson in 2015 or whatever, but it is interesting.
As we get down towards the end of our 45 minutes here before we open it up to Q&A, I want to ask you a little bit more generally about your experience at the GSB. the ways that it prepared you to be a founder and executive and run a startup, and maybe some of the ways that you feel you didn't get that preparation from business school and things that you had to kind of learn the hard way on the job.
Right. Well, I mean, so I'll answer the second question later, because actually I had this conversation with Garth Saloner. And it gets to the point of like scaling the company, and I was like, man, organizational design is hard. It's like people factors. It's like tricky. It's the like whenever like Lynn and I were like really like trying to like tease something out. It's like, how do you actually organize the company to achieve something and incent it? And like, well, maybe it makes more sense for these two people to own it, but like you prefer the single point of accountability, and these sorts of decisions are really hard. And I felt that there could have been more case studies around them. And Saloner's comment was, yeah, we agree with that, but we find that no one really understands what a problem that is until they experience it, and so the students don't sign up for that class. On the flip side, obviously, I think, getting back to how wonderful having a great partner was. Just the student body is amazing, and it's really unusual that you have such a bright group of people who are all unemployed at the same time. Because like as you get older, people are like, well, I'm starting this company, I'm looking for my founder, and I love this guy, but he just started that other thing, and it's kind of like a really unique moment in time. That's really helpful. I had worked for 4 years in private equity, and so like a lot of the general instruction, wasn't as helpful for me, but I loved the community and the teachers, and like just it was a fantastic time.
Nice. You mentioned having worked in private equity, and I heard maybe a little rip on the Blackstone and KKR folks earlier who were levering up mattress companies and selling them off to their friends. We have seen.
Well, it's good money. I'm not saying it's not good money.
I just want to make sure any of those folks out in the audience don't feel personally attacked. But we're trying to be inclusive here, even of the private equity bros. I do have a question about that, which is we're seeing this new wave of climate investment lately. We've seen TPG Rise and now TPG Climate. We've seen General Atlantic Beyond Net Zero. There are even, I think, not just some growth funds, but some buyout funds that are focused on energy, environment, and sustainability. As an executive, as a board member of a company that is really all about sustainability, fundamentally integrated into the business model, do these strike you as these fundraising, investing efforts around climate strike you as something that's likely to move the needle, or does it look like it's mostly ESG optics, or is it something in the middle there?
It's a great question. I think that the nature of most things that are required to solve climate are that they're massively capital intensive. Now, they're not necessarily equity capital intensive, right? And the ones that are going to be most successful are actually not equity capital intensive. But they are definitely capital intensive. So there is a huge need for debt capital in particular. And I think the interest, just like we do, we're going to do like $4 billion of debt and debt-like finance this year. And you can definitely see the group of investors growing, and that's wonderful and that's important. And I think on the infrastructure side is relatively low risk and medium return. And it's frankly, I think, an area that, it's not the kind of investing that's going to make you a gazillionaire, but it's actually, I think, quite an interesting, like risk-adjusted place, like on the whole spectrum. And so there's just a bottomless pit of that need globally, and so there are a lot of people heading into it. The equity investment side is interesting. As I said, I think that the better opportunities are probably more the productization of developed technologies rather than the 20-year haul on material sciences. But there are lots of people doing both, and like smart people like Bill Gates who are almost exclusively doing the 20-year hauls. So I certainly, I guess I'm not like there are smart people who disagree with me on that. But for sure, we're seeing more involvement in it. I think the ESG rating system leaves a little bit to be desired. On some metrics, like we're a solar company, we're carbon negative. We have a female CEO, awesome diversity, gender, pay equality, like blah blah blah, and like until we started spending $400,000 on our ESG report, we were getting like bad scores. So it's just, there's not really a ecosystem, I think, to properly evaluate this stuff yet. You've got some people doing it really poorly, and no one has really cracked the nut on how do I really measure, I think, ESG? Because it's like Chevron has an awesome ESG score. It's just weird.
Right.
So I think there's some work on the ESG side, and I think a lot of that is a little bit window dressing, but I think it will come.
Yeah, and I remember actually reading recently, there are 3 main ESG scores. They show very little correlation with each other, such that you have Chevron will score an 84 out of 100 on one of those ESG metrics and 10 out of 100 on another. And it just begs the question, what are we actually trying to measure here, right? I found that really
and there are people who would argue Tesla's not great on the G.
Right.
But it's, if we make global warming, there's some reasonable shot that Elon Musk deserves a lot of the credit. So
right.
it's, it's like anything, it's, you have to balance it.
Yeah. What advice would you give to someone who wants to found a clean tech company today with the lessons that you've learned from your experience?
It's just, I think the most helpful thing for us was it's just so nice to start a business that you wake up in the morning, and it's a tough day, and you just you just have a reason to get out of bed. That's just you can't underestimate that. And certainly before starting SunRun, I had never imagined that, I always felt okay, well, you succeed at business to make a bunch of money, and then you can do what you care about. And it's really interesting and rewarding to be able to meld those two things, and that's awesome. And I think not to underappreciate that. I think obviously there's a policy component, to a lot of this that is tricky and maybe not something that's in everyone's wheelhouses that you have to get smart on. And then you have to really think about the capitalization and how you're going to, and if you're just making something that you sell to someone, how are they going to sell it? What are they going to sell it with? Just understanding that ecosystem, and then depending on where in the ecosystem you are, just there are a lot of non-market factors. As I mentioned, you'd think a utility would make money by selling electricity, but they don't. They make money by making a capital investment, right? If their cost of capital is 6 and the regulators give them 11, they just want to buy everything. That's
right.
Just their business, and so having a great widget that lowers their cost, you might find is not as well received as you thought.
Right.
So just kind of understanding those dynamics are important.
Got it. And the last thing I'll ask you before we open it up for Q&A here is just, in the spirit of this being reunions weekend, I would love to hear about your best memory or memories from your time at the GSB.
My best memories are probably brownouts.
Okay.
No.
Not the utility kinds, to be clear.
Maybe. No, I think. Look, I have so many great friends from the GSB who I stay in touch with. Even going on vacation in Africa with some this summer, and that's just really special. I just it gets back to really what is anything other than the people that are doing it. And I just felt like the people here were so special, and not just the students and the faculty. And so, there were some interesting, classes that I thought were interesting, but really it was just the friendships that I formed and the personal moments, and crashing the Japanese study trip, things like that. But it'd be hard pressed to find a single moment that I want to share.
Good stuff. I'll let you off the hook on that one.
Okay.
Yeah. Awesome. So I think we can go ahead and open it up to Q&A. If our mic runners are able to take mics to people, great. Otherwise, just come on up to the mics that we have set out here.
Hi, Ed. Thanks for doing this talk. You've been working at this company for a really long time, and you have a female co-founder. Can you speak to what it might have been like for Lynn or women who've started companies across this 15-year period, and have you seen, from your unique vantage point of having a female co-founder, things evolving? Is it becoming more productive for women to start companies?
That's a great question, and there are some horrible things, that happened probably early on in the company's history, that are not my stories to tell, frankly. And there's certainly been a lot less of that recently. But I don't know if that's the size and scope of the company or the reputations of the people involved or the changing dynamics. So I think it's, my observation of it is that it's definitely getting better. But that's through my own lens, and it's hard for me to know if, on a static nature, starting for someone who would be back where we were in 2007, if it's different or not, and how that goes. I would hope so. I really hope so.
Go for it, buddy. Hey, Ed, very excited for what you guys have done at SunRun, but also excited for the Mary Powell era. Big fan of hers, and just want to hear from you. What do you think is next for SunRun, and what's the next era look like?
Yeah, I mean, electric vehicles are what's coming next. So, the business model, evolution was, first rooftop solar. Then it became clear to own our destiny, from a regulatory perspective, but also just as an amazing additional product, we needed to add stationary storage. That provides a reliability benefit, and lots of people now buy our product just for that. The United States is the least reliable grid in the OECD. It's getting worse. It's a huge pain point, especially here in California. And solar and storage is just such a fantastically better product than like a diesel generator that we were like, we have to go do that. What's happening now is that we're positioning ourselves really at the center of the electrification of heating and transportation. And 65% of all carbon emissions stem from decisions in the home. And one of the really cool things about electric vehicles is, you buy them like to drive them and go somewhere, but you actually don't use them 98% of the time. And then there's this giant battery that sits in them that's like basically doing nothing. And so we thought, okay, well, what if we could use that battery, to do other things? And so that's actually how we ended up in this partnership with Ford on the F-150 Electric Lightning, which is launching imminently. And it's the first electric vehicle with what's called bidirectional charging. So not only can you charge the car at home, but you can use it to power your home or to export power to the grid. And the pickup truck also, it's like very core to that, the branding of that truck. Like you can plug an arc welder into that pickup truck. You need to ask permission from PG&E to do that. But the Ford pickup truck, you just plug it in. And the opportunity for that on climate change and power reliability is amazing. So if you had 1 million electric vehicles connected in California, each dispatching 50% of their battery, you would eliminate all fossil fuel use between 6 p.m. and midnight, which is most fossil fuel use in the state. Those batteries are already being built. They're already being bought for transportation, right? And like this gets back to the utility arguments. The utility is like, well, but centralized storage costs less than distributed storage. And you're like, yeah, but the people are going to buy these pickup trucks regardless, right? So the marginal cost to serve the grid with this pickup truck is actually fantastically low. And it allows you to back up your home, for 3 days in a power outage or infinitely if you have a solar system. And so we're now, helping people, and we co-developed the technology that allows that truck to plug into the home and work bidirectionally and to back up your home in a power outage. And we're working now with other manufacturers, and there'll be other products behind that, right? And so the goal is to really just help people electrify their homes, and then once they've bought all these things, to use them in a smart way to like help us combat climate change, which is really valuable. So actually, vehicle to grid in California, the research suggests, this is bidirectional charging, is worth $3,000 per vehicle per year. It's a huge number. And so you can share that with your customers, right? And so that's where we're going with the business now, is like taking this next step into like whole home electrification, helping people, take that journey and make it as cost effective and rewarding for them as they can.
So you guys have mentioned a few times that you had a lot of struggles with regulators and utilities, which I I feel you on that.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, there are a few different types of utility structures in the United States. Most of them are investor-owned utilities. And I think there are some legitimate questions about, now that we're in the energy transition, the role of utilities is changing. Do investor-owned utilities prioritize shareholders first or ratepayers first?
Yeah.
And so I guess my broad question is, given that we're going through the energy transition, is the investor-owned utility model a viable model for sort of servicing that transition?
That's a great question. Investor-owned utilities caring about their ratepayers is like a costume that doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Like, they care about their shareholders. And what's interesting is how much more expensive in power from an investor-owned utility is. So, I think a lot of people think, well, governments aren't very good at running things, so it's probably more expensive to have your government run the utility. Investor-owned utilities are kind of run like governments. But more importantly, they pay income taxes. The debt that they sell is taxable. And then they earn a 11% return on equity. So if you said, well, what if PG&E was just owned by San Francisco or whatever? Suddenly their debt cost goes down by 30% because they can sell tax-exempt debt. They don't have to pay any income taxes. And then there's no need to return an 11% profit. So you could probably layer in a lot of incompetence and still break even on that trade, right? But I don't know how well that is understood. And maybe, by the way, you could get a better management team. I think, like PG&E, I feel for right now. Like, I would not want to be trying to recruit great people to work at PG&E. I mean, I'm just trying to imagine walking into a cocktail party. Hey, I just took a job at PG&E. You'll be like. So I think there's a real challenge with how do you set up the financial structure and the management and how do you do that? It's very difficult. And there are some things investor-owned utilities do well, and there are some investor-owned utilities that actually do a great job, right? But not all. My personal suspicion is probably municipal-run utilities are going to be more on the forefront and are going to be lower cost. And they generally are if you actually look at it. And that's, I think, probably a better, cheaper, faster model. But at the same time, as we've seen in healthcare, changing the way this stuff works is just fantastically difficult.
I've actually got a quick follow-up for you on that, on the point of distributed energy resources and who's going to operate, who's going to coordinate the distribution grid. Obviously, that flow has been one way for a long time, from centralized power stations down through transmission, through the distribution system to your house. Now it's more bidirectional at the local level. There's a lot of discussion over who should be the distribution system operator, right? Should it be utilities? Should it be distributed energy resource aggregators and virtual power plants? Should it be some government-owned entity that's entirely separate from those? Does SunRun have an official position on who the distribution system operator of the future ought to be?
Well, most of it is done at the grid level. So in California, Cal ISO, the independent system operator, does most of that. Right. And there are requirements that utilities have sufficient resources, and they have to demonstrate that. And then if you're going to provide the resources to the utilities, you need to demonstrate that. And it's definitely arcane and complicated. Probably having an independent agency like Cal ISO do it is most effective because it's really their business model already, and they're good at it, and they're independent, and they don't have a particular profit motive to do it. But I think what needs to happen is, and I think distributed energy companies like us also have invested fantastically in software to make it happen. And so normally how it works in the energy world is those sorts of arrangements are financial in nature, right? You basically say, I promise to do this, and I post credit, and then you run your own software, right? That's more how it works, and I think there's a reasonable model for that. What I think has to happen though is companies like ours, as we grow bigger, and instead of installing 20 kW of storage, we start having 120 kW cars. It just is quickly, within a couple of years, it's going to be so big that people are going to have to be calling people like us, rather than us saying, hey, who's going to do it? So I think our perspective is like, we're just building so much of it out. Let's just get it built out now. And then at some point, you're going to be sitting on, a gigawatt of storage, and then the phone's going to ring. And you actually don't really care so much like who's calling. But my personal perspective is I think that like Cal ISO in that example would be the better entity.
Okay, interesting.
Hi. Can you share more about the first days of the company?
Yeah.
I mean, from the time you had this idea until you got a company actually working, was it the usual go to roadshow and get the money and start the operations, or was it just start operations and then get some money? I'm interested to know if the investors wanted to see if the model worked before they pour money on it, or they just bought the idea and then start investing.
So initially we capitalized it ourselves for a while, and then we did an angel round. And I think our clear observation in the angel round was like people who know you, who trust you, will invest knowing nothing about the sector. And people who you go to who know a lot about the sector and think, oh, that's kind of interesting, often don't invest because they don't know you. And so I feel like the younger a company is, the more fundraising is really about the individuals involved, frankly, than the business plan. And then over time, as you start to demonstrate product market fit, you're transitioning, I think, to investors who are more like sector investors. So we had, I don't know, maybe 8 months of sort of like our own capital funding, and then and maybe another 8 or 9 months of like people I used to work for, people Lynn used to work for, and like some people who are in the room, but mostly people we used to work for. And I felt, and that was just so much higher hit rate and effective that like, again, when people ask me for advice in venture funding, or angel funding, my usual go-to advice is start with like, if there's anyone well capitalized who you've worked for before, start there. And I think that's the right place to start. And then yes, once we got, it was clearly working that there was customer demand, the unit economics worked, but still before we had raised this tax capital, we did our first institutional round. And that was foundation, which was, it was a little edgier because we didn't have the tax capital in place, and obviously it was tricky as the Great Recession was coming on to get it. But we got it, and it worked, and then from there it was Excel, Sequoia, and I think it was just obvious product market fit from there.
I think we've probably got time for 1 or 2 more.
Maybe just more recently, or since you went public, talk about the decision to go public and managing being a public company, and just how the investment climate has evolved and changed, both on the equity side and with rates rising and the cost of capital going up.
Yeah, well, so 2 things about being public. So first, there are definite pluses and minuses to being public, and I think having worked in private equity, I was mostly terrified. Like, oh my God, we're going to make dumb decisions. We're going to do stuff for, but actually what I underestimated is the visibility of being public and the visibility of the results are so much higher that like people really push to make things happen, I think. Maybe if we had been better managers, this wouldn't have been the case. But I feel like, missing the quarter is so high profile, like no one wants to do that when you're public. When you've got some nice VC guy who shows up every once in a while, like, oh, that's okay, make it up next. It's like there's just that, people just rally around the results more, I think. And that's a really powerful force. I think the negatives are well understood. Just like, can you make long-term decisions? Do you manage for the short term, blah, blah. And I think if you're clear enough with investors about what you're doing, like you get a lot of leeway there. Not infinite, but a lot. Certainly the public markets have been very volatile, and like the most of the trading of the company's stock is literally sector. Right, I joke with people. I'm like, if it had been legal to try to insider trade, like I probably would have lost money. It's like kind of a random walk, which is a little fascinating. And it's mostly gone up and down with the sector. And I think that the rise in passive investing, has kind of amplified that. The increase in interest rates of late has been fascinating to watch. The thing that has been, the saving grace for us is that we sell electric energy. As I mentioned, utilities are monopolies. They waste no time passing through their higher operating capital and fuel costs to customers. And so we can raise pricing behind them, right? It's amazing. Like since October, like a defined string of 20-year cash flows is worth like 15 to 20% less than it was in October. But guess what? Like electric rates are up that much too. So, we're raising, our rates behind them. And the actual surge in inflation has just made like the demand for the business come off the chart. So, the capital cost is going up, but the customer price is going, like there's a lot of changes happening. And so it's a very dynamic environment. But like, and one that isn't always understood immediately by investors. But I like over the long arch, I'm a fan of it. If you ever do want to, do a capital raise, you can do it instantly. In January of last year, we raised $400 million in convertible debt at a 0% coupon with like 3 days of work. Like that's nice to be in that position if you want to be. But you wouldn't want to do that today. So it's up and down.
Awesome. I know we're coming up on time here. I've just got one more quick thing for you before we wrap up, which is the new Stanford Climate and Sustainability School launches this fall. And there's a lot of hype, a lot of talk about it. I think a lot of excitement, certainly from folks in my class. I'm pursuing the EIPER joint degree in environment and resources alongside my MBA. I'd be curious to hear, as this new school gets ready to launch, your thoughts on kind of the role of business education in educating future leaders about sustainability and the environment and the importance of those types of topics.
Well, it's interesting. I think a lot of the challenges like very much lend themselves, understanding the challenges lend themselves to an academic setting. Like how long do we have? Like how much of this material is there in the earth? Like what is the amount of solar energy that shows up every day? So and because energy is something that's important to people, not just sustainable, but period, there's just insane amounts of data, right? So it's actually very easy to study. And then the other thing, which I think is part of the mission here, is the interdisciplinary nature of it. Making these sorts of businesses work does require a lot of different skills. I'm often asked, what's the secret to your success, or what's the one thing that like SunRun does better than, and there's not really one thing. And if it's that there are many things, and you have to coordinate them all. And if you look at the companies in our industry who failed, there was one who had a problem with sales, there was one who had a problem with finance, there was one who had a problem with construction. Or marketing. There's just a lot of things you have to tie together. And so I think having an environment where you can pick across these different areas. Tax law, is like massively featured in renewables in the United States because it's all subsidized in the tax regime. So being able to have that multidisciplinary reach, I think, is also helpful.
Well said. I think we'll leave it there, folks. Thank you so much to Ed for joining us for this. Thanks also to the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies. Thanks to all of you for attending. Just like to remind you quickly that I believe we have a networking event to follow up the conversation starting outdoors very shortly. So thanks so much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you.